Snow White? Hello, everyone. Ah, man. 1937 was quite a revolutionary year for the foundation of the Disney Company, led by the man himself, Walt Disney. He worked tirelessly hard, practically selling his whole garage, to my recollection, just to get this Snow White project done, and people at the time thought an animated full-length movie could never have been done. And well, Walt Disney had the last laugh. And Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs kept replaying in cinemas over and over and over again, and would influence generations of artists and families alike. Now, in 2025, it has taken approximately 2 years or so for a live-action remake rendition of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, or in this case just Snow White, to come out in the cinemas. Except, before this movie even released in the cinemas, it was already a failure.
It's what you would expect from a live-action remake. Take a beloved animated classic, make it live-action. If they're really lucky, capture 10% of the magic.
I don't know if I've ever seen a movie have this kind of backlash before it was even released. We have staged premieres and journalists being banned from them, or scaled back premieres. Whatever you do feel about it, the discourse is heated and you can't deny that, which is amusing to a degree, but I also think it says a lot symbolically, obviously, about the disconnect between Hollywood and its audiences from so many different angles. But then just comes the disdain for modern Disney and what it represents. So there's all kinds of different things. I think when you combine it all to a fever pitch, the whole thing kind of combusts.
The Disney live-action Snow White is a soulless, boring, unfocused, nonsensical, indulgent, unenjoyable slog. Now, such a statement might make me look like a prejudiced hater, but truly, if this film was good, I would praise it. One of my favorite films ever made is the Disney live-action Cinderella, one of the most wholesome, uplifting, inspiring, and heartfelt films ever made, and which stands as the gold standard for live-action fairy tale films and contrasts so devastatingly to the live-action Snow White and exposes how hollow and pathetic it really is, by demonstrating just how much Disney has lost their way.
Fearless, fair, brave, and truly awful. In a world where 90% of Disney live-action remakes are mediocre, you still had things like Christopher Robin, which was a wonderful film. The rest are easily forgettable, and Snow White is the worst of the entire series.
Snow White, whose trailer accrued a staggering 1 million dislikes, is a sanitized product that takes a cherished, simple fairy tale, makes it look ugly as all hell, radiates corporate risk-averse unease, and has more baggage than a therapist's waiting room.
In order to justify the reason why, we need to go over a history of the very foundation of the premise of this particular movie, the live-action Disney remake. Now, ever since Tim Burton made his own adaptation of Alice in Wonderland, and especially after Disney's attempt at cashing in on Wicked's success, presumably with Maleficent, the Disney company had been in a long corporate line of creating these live-action Disney remakes to their beloved animated classics. Most, but not all, of the live-action Disney remakes have been heavily criticized because, unlike their original animated counterparts, most of the live-action Disney remakes lacked the narrative cohesion, the likable characterization, and the overall timeless theming that made the original animated classic so beloved. There were some exceptions, though. The Glenn Close 101 Dalmatians movie and its sequel, as well as the Cinderella remake, and debatably a few others, did win some people over to the potential of what these remakes could offer. But, sadly, for the most part, these live-action remakes were dull and corporatized and only thrived purely because of monkey brain nostalgia. And these remakes only got worse the more that the woke agenda infested the Disney company over the years. Thematically, just like how the evil queen took over the kingdom in the story, I would imagine. So, some of you might be thinking, Callum, what on earth is this woke agenda that you've been mentioning for the past wee while? Wokeism is a form of politically liberal extremism that has immense hypocritical double standards on diversity and representation. For example, woke propagandists will constantly prop up their female protagonists as so flawless as action heroines that they leave no room for authentic character growth. A lot of the time, they come across as fairly arrogant, and their abrasiveness is never called into question, and it's constantly being celebrated. Another example of woke storytelling is the woke treatment towards masculinity. You see, the woke agenda has this intense, envious disdain towards masculinity. So they'll portray a lot of their male characters as effeminate and pathetic, and they'll usually portray male characters, especially white male characters, as evil patriarchal figures that need to be taken down. Now, that doesn't apply to everything they make, but a lot of what they make. You'll notice the patterns. Now, some of you may recall in recent memory that on this channel, I reviewed the Rings of Power show and Star Wars The Acolyte show. I'd say both of those shows are some of the peak examples of woke propaganda. So I've noticed that over time, more and more people are catching on to the patterns of woke propaganda. So by the time the Little Mermaid remake came out, people were starting to notice the woke trends, especially in one particular scene where Ariel's the one that saves the day and not Eric, which leads to a lot of narrative incohesion. Ariel is a mermaid. How on earth would she know how to properly steer a ship? I guess basic observation can help, but at the same time, if Eric the human is not the one to save the day in that particular scene, how is Triton supposed to be convinced that humans and mermaids can live in harmony? In the original film, Triton saw Eric save his own daughter, which made Triton open up to peace and harmony between mermaids and humans. I could go on and on about everything wrong with that scene, but what you need to know is that these kind of changes were made not because they made coherent sense. It's completely incoherent. They only did it for superficial social pandering purposes. This kind of pandering from the woke propaganda has gotten so extreme and so obnoxious that even South Park and Deadpool had to call it out. So you can imagine that by the time the Snow White remake came out and it was announced that a Colombian actress was to portray the titular Snow White, a character whom I remind you again was originally called as such because her skin was meant to be as white as snow in a Germanic setting, this character is going to be portrayed by a Colombian actress. Colombian!
Snow White, who has been changed to actually cinnamon brown this time.
Nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with that. People are like, how you gonna be brown and be called Snow White? What kind of ironic shit is that? What kind of hipsters you hanging around? No, Snow White in this case is very brown, but she was born during a snowstorm. Mm-hmm. That's how they got around that. No, it don't make no sense still, but sure.
You gotta think. You gotta think your way out of these things.
You can, do acrobatics to try to make that make sense to me. I ain't buying it, but anyway.
What's their excuse? Oh, well, Snow White was born that way because she survived a snowstorm. Okay, well, if that's how you're going to name characters, then Brad Pitt should portray T'Challa, aka Black Panther, in, well, Black Panther. And his character could earn the title of Black Panther because he hunted down a Black Panther. Oh, what's that? The woker screaming? Okay, if you don't permit another ethnicity to portray Black Panther, why are you allowing Rachel Zegler to get away with portraying Snow White? This kind of double standard doesn't make any sense. I mean, I can get behind the idea of, people getting in costume regardless of ethnicity and, having a fun time with, certain stuff like that. But here's the thing. This is meant to be a remake of the film that started it all. If you want to make a film based on the film that started it all for your own company, would it not make sense to at least pay respect to what happened? But here's the thing. Controversy started piling up, one by one. Peter Dinklage, an actor, expressed that he was annoyed at the fact that short people like himself were still being typecast as dwarven characters, even though he himself has made a profit of making dwarven characters for years. Talk about climbing up the career ladder, then kicking it down so that no one else could climb back up. So, Disney, presumably not realizing that, Disney decided to obey the double standards of Peter Dinklage and showcase something that made people presume would be the replacements of the Seven Dwarfs at the time, which caused a lot of hysterical backlash. And so, Disney tried to change that again, this time keeping the dwarves, but making them disturbing CGI things. We'll get to that later. Side note, there's this YouTube channel called Kermode and Mayo's Take, and the two gentlemen running that channel have made a review of the Snow White movie and topic, in which they've read a letter from someone behind the scenes saying that there's been this mischaracterization about the initial controversy regarding those 7 bandit characters. It seems that the whole intention all along was to have the 7 bandit characters be completely separate characters from the 7 dwarfs, not replacements of them. The controversy occurred because people perceived at the time, without the full information we have now, that people perceived that the 7 bandit characters were the replacement for the 7 dwarfs, and people perceived that as Disney getting desperate to not offend people.
I worked on Snow White for the calendar year of 2022. I have watched with a heavy heart since then at how the film has become a political punchbag, particularly in the US, and how falsehoods have been allowed to proliferate and go unchallenged. Based on a paparazzi photo of Snow White with 7 characters who appeared not to be dwarves, it was reported that the film would not feature Doc, Sneezy, Happy, Dopey, et al. This led to an avalanche of criticism that the film had, in quotes, gone woke. I don't think it's a spoiler to reveal that the individuals photographed were simply other different characters, the bandits.
Okay, you remember that picture in which it was like, hey, here are the substitutes for the 7 dwarves that aren't going to be 7 dwarves? But the internet, and I'm paraphrasing here, internet said, how about not? Much to my surprise, those folks are still in this film. She runs across these bandits. Those are the bandits.
Another rumour circulated that this band of 7 were to be branded magical creatures, which stoked the flames further. This has an equally simple explanation. The animated classic from 1937 sees Snow White encounter a friendly group of rabbits, chipmunks, squirrels, deer, and bluebirds in the forest, and it is these cheerful critters that moniker refers to. Shortly afterwards, Peter Dinklage made some comments on a podcast.
I was out with them for a bit, and now I'm in a completely different film. Kind of felt like DLC. It felt like Snow White DLC. You know when you get a new game, DLC being downloadable content? Gamer speak. But you know when you get the new game and maybe you get the DLC for free, maybe it's day 1 DLC, maybe it's pre-order DLC, maybe it was on sale. But the DLC is now in the game as you're doing the main campaign, and then you accidentally jump tracks to the DLC, and now you're on this really involved side quest that feels nothing like the original game you were just playing. Yeah, it's kind of like that. But for Snow White, you're hanging out with these bandits you don't know, you don't care about. Granted, they do mingle with the dwarves for a spell, but you can't help but see it. 2 possible options going down here, my friends. 1, initially there were going to be no dwarves in this Snow White film. The bandits were going to be the substitute for the dwarves. The internet, again, paraphrasing, said, how about not? Studio panicked, refilmed scenes with the dwarves, and now you have 2 different versions of this film just colliding head on. Or this film, as it stands, dwarves and bandits both being in here, was always how it was planned to be, but they released this picture to fabricate internet outrage because internet's gonna do what internet does, and no press is bad press. I don't know. I'll probably never know, but you can't help but see that Snow White and the 7 Dwarves and Snow White and the 7 Bandits are 2 different feeling films that are almost in competition on screen.
The story that we're always told is that, well, Mark, you just like films because you agree with their politics. And all the politics of this are politics that I'm sort of, broadly on board with. Therefore, it does disappoint me to say that I think it's quite bad.
And yeah, it would probably make sense for the Disney company to say that was our intention. But then that begs the question, if it was their intention the whole time to have the 7 bandit characters be separate from the 7 dwarf characters, why didn't they just clarify that in the first place? And it would have prevented them from so much backlash, which again, says that they've done such a poor job at marketing this movie. The Disney company, Rachel Zegler and Peter Dinklage have done such a poor job at properly representing what this movie could have been if they had given it a chance. And so, because of this controversy, other short people and other short actors and actresses were rightly getting rather frustrated at the lost opportunity to get paid for portraying dwarven actors in a wholesome movie. Like, as of recently, these short actors and actresses are protesting outside the Disney studios about the roles that they had missed out on. Now, some of you might object and say, but Callum, there have been significantly taller actors who portrayed dwarves for years. They used clever use of perspective and visual effects to make these actors seem shorter than they actually are. They did it with John Rhys-Davies, who is a 6-foot-something tall man, and made him portray Gimli the dwarf. They did the same thing with the likes of Ian McShane and a few other men to portray dwarf characters in Snow White and the Huntsman. So why are you complaining about short people not being hired to play dwarves in this case? I'm bringing this up because modern corporate Disney just won't shut up about virtue signaling, about caring about diversity and inclusion. But the thing is, modern corporate Disney have become so afraid of taking risks and so afraid of offending anybody that they think any portrayal of short people in a typical dwarven fashion will somehow offend short people. But short people saying, no, we'd love to be in this opportunity. I mean, by all means, it is possible to have tall people portray short people. That is entirely possible. But the thing is, modern Disney just won't shut up about virtue signaling. And when an opportunity came for them to represent a certain group, they hesitated because they were afraid of offending certain short people. Which begs the question, if they were willing to kindly hire that one short actor, the one who portrays the guy who's a crossbow expert, why couldn't they have just done the same with all the other dwarf characters in the movie in the first place? If you were willing to hire one short actor, why not go all the way with it? It doesn't make sense. If that wasn't bad enough, then you had Rachel Zegler's approach to the whole thing. Rachel Zegler has shown herself to be an absolute narcissist in press interviews, claiming that the original Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs movie is outdated. She blatantly misrepresented it, leading to a lot of backlash from longtime Disney fans who were deeply offended by what she had to say.
I know that you've told me before that your version of Snow White is different, and it's more of a 2022 version of Snow White. What did you mean by that?
I mean, you know, the original cartoon came out in 1937, and very evidently so. There is a big focus on her love story with a guy who literally stalks her.
Yeah.
Weird.
Super weird.
So we didn't do that this time.
She claimed that Snow White in the original falls in love with a prince who literally stalks her. Weird. That kind of claim presupposes that the prince was in the background throughout the entire movie, and yet there's no hint of that. In fact, if you look behind the scenes, Walt Disney was originally going to have a subplot with the prince stuck in prison and initially escaping but failing to rescue Snow White on time before she died and then bring her back to life via true love's kiss, but he didn't have the time and resources to get that fully realized. But I've noticed in this movie, the live action remake does have that subplot in there. So it makes me think, come on, surely Rachel Zegler has to be somewhat aware of that subplot. Surely, right?
Yeah.
Weird.
Come on.
So no prince or a different kind of prince?
We have a different approach to what I'm sure a lot of people will assume is a love story just because, like, we cast a guy in the movie.
Right.
Andrew Burnap, great dude.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that I think everyone's going to have their assumptions. Anybody's guess until 2024. All of Andrew's scenes could get cut. Who knows? It's Hollywood, baby.
She wouldn't stop saying things that offended longtime Disney fans and practically stomped on the legacy of Walt Disney and what he founded. You'd think that portraying the main character of an adaptation of the movie that started the entire company in which the film is centered around, you'd think Rachel Zegler would be smart enough to have more respect, right?
You said you were bringing a modern edge to it on stage. What do you mean by that?
I just mean that it's no longer 1937, and we absolutely wrote a Snow White that is
not going to be saved by the prince.
She's not going to be saved by the prince, and she's not going to be dreaming about true love. She's dreaming about becoming the leader she knows she can be.
But it gets worse. Rachel Zegler just wouldn't shut her mouth about politics, which by default is very divisive, which caused further disinterest from any potential audiences, to the point where the box office bookings and seatings are almost null and void.
There were like hardly any cars in the parking lot. In the theater we were in, there was 3 other people.
There was immense beef between Gal Gadot and Rachel Zegler for reasons I'm not even going to bother going into here.
Let's be real here. Putting Rachel Zegler in front of a hot mic is a bit like putting a toddler with ADHD in charge of a nuclear launch button.
Setting aside the tragedy of the fact that Disney learned far too late to not give her a microphone when she's doing press for this film, I actually make the argument that her version of what the film was, per her explanation, it's not actually the film.
All this has caused so much of a sour taste for longtime Disney fans like myself. And so now the actual film is here. It is tangible, it is here. So, how did it do? Okay, in order to explain the film review, I need something to make it less painful. I need to take it easy on myself. I'll get some Coca-Cola. One infused with Jack Daniels whiskey! Yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, I can feel the Scottish booze coursing through my body. Oh, that's better, that's better. Anyway, the film admittedly starts off on a somewhat charming start, with the animals opening up the book and a narrator who reads out the story. There's a transition from illustration to live action. It gives the arbitrary reason to justify Rachel Zegler's casting as Snow White. You get this opening musical sequence of how prosperous the kingdom is through the power of kindness and apple pies. This first wee bit isn't that terrible, but you can sense there's this artificial nature to it, a very corporate structure to it. There's a sort of superficial glaze to the visuals and the colorization. I mean, certainly the bright, vibrant colors can be appealing for families, and it's great to see all these people like dancing about and stuff like that. But as you notice throughout the film, it's obvious that they relied too heavily on CGI and an exaggerated, hazy kind of coloring, whereas Warner Brothers was able to pull off something immense when they were making their own musical adaptation of Wicked. With Wicked, they got actual immense practical sets and a great production value in regards to costumes and practical creatures, and using CGI sparingly by comparison. So if Warner Brothers is able to do something like that, then what on earth did Disney spend over $400 billion on? Like, there's a lot of scenes where they could have just easily gone out to the real woods, and, you know, for some scenes they do, but they didn't bother to build some practical sets for certain areas of the castle or certain aspects of the cottage. It's all just superficial junk.
Yeah. Weird.
But anyway, we were treated with the backstory of how Snow White was raised to believe in being loyal, brave, and true. Oh, sorry, I'm thinking of the live-action Mulan. Sorry. True and brave and just whatever slogan for today is. And sadly, her mom dies, and that leaves the evil queen character portrayed by Gal Gadot, which I'll get into later, coming into the kingdom to work her way up to power. The king falls in love with the evil queen. They get married, and the evil queen manages to manipulate the king to go out for some kind of war or something, which presumably she managed to fabricate somehow.
It was all a ruse, you pathetic little ant.
Which leads to the king never coming back. And so she gets into power, she hogs all the jewels, all the resources, all the stuff, all for pretty little her. And of course, she has her mirror on the wall, whom she asks who is the fairest of them all. The mirror says, "You're the fairest of them all." But then, of course, Snow White comes of age. She still maintains her values of kindness and the power of community. And so because she's fair, look, okay, I'll get into why this is a bit silly in a moment. Snow White is now fairer than the Evil Queen in regards to appearance. The magic mirror tells the Evil Queen that, and the Evil Queen gets jealous of Snow White's looks. Now, in the context of this live-action remake, there is something quite ridiculous about this presentation. Jeremy Jans, can you explain why?
Who is the fairest of them all?
Well, lady called the Evil Queen, since we're talking about internal beauty, you're pretty much the worst. I think you'll have to wipe out every woman in the land in order to be the fairest of them all. Except for Karen. She yelled at the butcher's boy. Said, I'd like to speak to your manager now. She is just awful. But other than that, you're pretty screwed. Or maybe it is just external beauty, in which this would be the shortest film ever.
Who is the fairest of them all?
What, you mean between you and the girl with the Lord Farquaad wig? Pretty sure you're the biggest smoke show in the land. You got nothing to worry about. Rest easy.
Thank you, Jeremy Jans. Just who was in charge of casting these actresses? Who was in charge of casting? Because it was such a poor idea to have Gal Gadot, one of the most objectively beautiful women alive, as the Evil Queen, and then corporate Disney's trying to convince us that her character is jealous of a character portrayed by Rachel Zegler. Now, I don't mean to insult Rachel Zegler's looks, but have you seen Gal Gadot? You're trying to convince me that Gal Gadot is jealous of the looks of Rachel Zegler? Rachel Zegler's version of Snow White? That's like trying to convince me that Griffith from Berserk is jealous of the Stalker from Perfect Blue, or that Chris Hemsworth is jealous of the body type of Jeremy Clarkson. But whatever, the show must go on. And so, after Snow White manages to release a thief free from a public punishment, the Evil Queen notices, but instead of having guards to guard that one guy who was tied up in the first place, or perhaps locking her up in the dungeon, she goes through with that plan to have Snow White go out into the wilderness and have the huntsman kill her there? I mean, I know that the Evil Queen is in a position of power to give any kind of punishment she chooses. I get it. But the inciting incident that makes the Evil Queen commit to her plan to kill Snow White seems a bit odd. I mean, she punishes this petty thief for stealing some potatoes by having him be tied up in the gate to freeze to death. And yet Snow White is able to just walk up to the gate and just untie the rope and just get him to go free. Like, did you not even bother to have at least two guards, like, guard the prisoner, just keep watch of him as he suffers? And you saw Snow White do the whole thing. Like, you have the public right to, like put her in the dungeon in a public manner. Just get the whole thing over with, right? It seemed kind of odd to me. You see, with the original fairy tale, it's more straightforward. Evil Queen is jealous of Snow White's looks, and so she commits to the huntsman killing of Snow White so that she doesn't get the blame. There, bam, simple, straight to the point. But with this remake, the Queen sees Snow White get this guy free, whom she could have easily sent guards to oversee, and since this was out in the public, and yet the public doesn't notice, like, why doesn't she, lock her up in the dungeon? It just seems a bit oddly structured. Notice how this is a common pattern. The live-action version of Snow White lacks the coherent sense of narrative structure that the original had. Now, the original worked because it was so simple, but in the live-action remake, as much as they make an attempt to flesh out certain characters and scenarios, it still comes across as very disjointed, and I think that has very much to do with the constant reshoots due to the constant controversial backlash that I mentioned earlier. But regardless, the Evil Queen gets the huntsman to go get Snow White out picking for apples, and the huntsman nearly kills off Snow White, and admittedly, there was a wee bit of interesting characterization where the huntsman tells Snow White to flee before I change my mind. That was interesting, and there were some occasional moments that made me go, that was interesting conceptually. Like, there's a later scene in the finale where the Evil Queen says to Snow White, all right, you think you're worthy to rule? Takes a diamond knife. Go on, kill me. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. I looked at the scene and I thought, yeah, she's gonna reject it, but that seems like an interesting scene to challenge the protagonist's ideals. Like, I see some little glimpses like that, and I see some potential for a potentially good movie to come out from this mess of a movie. It's like this whole thing I've seen is just a first draft, and somewhere underneath all that is this brilliant movie that's just waiting to be explored, waiting to be wonderfully portrayed, and yet it's never given the full time to shine, and the whole thing just comes across as very dull and disappointingly boring. That's a common theme throughout this entire movie. So anyway, Snow White runs through the forest, she encounters the woodland creatures, and instead of singing a merry little song to cheer herself up and gather the animals around her, the animals just seem to just kind of gather to her, and instead of having this lengthy journey, well, reasonably lengthy journey to go from where she was to the cottage, it seems like the animals just instantly indicate there's the cottage. And what happens next is very odd on a structure basis. You see, I know that the live action Snow White is portrayed as kind, but the way her kindness is portrayed, it lacks a coherent structure compared to the original Snow White. Like, I'll say why. You see, in the original, Snow White is led by the animals to this cottage. She looks inside and wonders if anyone's home. She goes in and notices that it's untidy. Cue the whistle while you work song. She, alongside the animals, tidies up, and Snow White tidies up as a form of gratitude for shelter from her running away from the evil queen. And so once she's all done, she goes upstairs to the bedroom to rest. And then she notices, oh wow, look at these 7 significantly small beds and these particularly quirky names. She thinks to herself, oh, they must be children. And then she gets so tired that she gets the beds together and just decides to just have a nap. And so she rests. And then later the dwarves come along. They have all these suspicions as to what Snow White could be, but eventually they warm up to her and allow her to stay. And she treats them right in regards to hygiene and stuff like that later on. But with the live action remake, Snow White just instantly goes into the cottage. She doesn't tidy up because the house isn't in a particularly untidy state, and she immediately goes into the bedroom without any question whatsoever. She doesn't question why the beds are so small.
Weird.
And then the dwarves are working, then they get home, and the dwarves don't take as long a time to address the suspicion of Snow White as much as they did in the original. They just go straight up, and then hijinks ensue, and then they greet Snow White. And it's not until the next morning when the dwarves make a mess of themselves. Dwarves get into this fight in their dining area. It's meant to come across as lighthearted and goofy, but with how disturbing these CGI dwarves are, I'll get through. And with how mean-spirited the whole thing comes across, this was my response throughout the whole scene. And so it's then that Snow White does the whistle while you work song, but instead of saying, I will use the broom, she says, you do the thing, and you use the broom, which seems to imply that she's just mostly letting everyone else do the work around her. Although, to be fair, Rachel Zegler's Snow White does contribute to the tidying up, using the broom and helping lift things up and stuff like that. But the original Snow White was much more active in her role of tidying up and being a good role model compared to the Rachel Zegler version. It's not that the Rachel Zegler version doesn't have any traits of kindness or a sense of responsibility to tidy up in the movie. The new version seems more like virtue signaling compared to the original version, which seemed to more personify practicing actual virtue. And prior to gaining access to see the full film, people saw early footage and got the impression that Rachel Zegler wasn't going to bother to do any of the work at all, judging by the leaked footage of you use this and you use that, which seemed to give a bad taste in people's mouths, that, as if to say Rachel Zegler's Snow White wasn't going to bother doing the tidying up herself, but that's clearly not entirely the case, but it's just something to keep in mind. So, as you can tell, the original Snow White has much more narrative coherence compared to the new version. And the lackluster quality of the new Snow White is definitely felt with the CGI dwarves. Who are you? What have you done with my 7 homies? Good grief! Look at them! This CGI is so disturbingly ugly! It seems that Snow White's entered the 9th level of the uncanny valley! I mean, look at this! I mean, what were they thinking? Come on, Disney's capable of better CGI than this? What is this? It's meant to come across as rather charming and wholesome.
In the original film, there is a visual plushness. These dwarves are an uncanny, unholy VFX disaster, figures from one of those Hieronymus Bosch visions of hell. They slow the film to a crawl every time they appear, and there's no sense of their glowing enchanted forest meshing with scenes shot in real woodlands, or the dwarves themselves belonging alongside live people. Disney should be embarrassed with its resources to have created such lame animated characters, lacking in clarity and definition, who seem to floatingly swirl and caper without depth and weight, whose resting faces are disconcerting, and who look about as good as the Smurfs from 15 years ago. All the sadder for the extraordinary, captivating innovations of the original renderings.
To add insult to injury, and I know the dwarves are meant to be somewhat cartoonish anyway, but the dwarven characters in the live-action version lack the kind of weightiness to mesh well with the live-action people. Not to mention, right after the Whistle While You Work sequence, Snow White immediately reverts back to concern about finding her father. And it doesn't really feel organic at all. That kind of conversation is brought up, not because it feels like a natural conversational flow, but feels more like we need to get the plot moving forward. And I'm sorry, here's a major writing tip. If you're writing dialogue in such a way to just simply get the plot moving forward, rather than because it feels like something the characters would say, you really need to make another draft of the script altogether.
If you don't get physically ill seeing your first rough cut, something's wrong.
Weird.
Something's wrong.
So Snow White ventures out from the cottage and then comes across the thief she set free earlier, as well as the 7 diversity hires that caused a lot of initial controversy earlier. And this is where it really feels like the film's getting sidetracked.
The bandit screen time feels oddly truncated and chopped up, and the narrative loses natural emphasis and cohesion.
I mean, I guess this exists just for the sake of building up the romance between Snow White and this thief character. And look, I'm not going to entirely defend the original Snow White, but at the same time, Walt Disney with the original was intending to flesh out the prince character, but just simply lacked the time to do so. But even with what little he was able to do, he was still able to do so much with so little. But with this romance between Snow White and this thief character, you don't really get many scenes to convince you that they're a liable couple. Compared to the likes of Rapunzel and Flynn Rider, aka Eugene Fitzherbert, or even like Tiana and Naveen, if you get what I mean.
Also recut and relayered with the love story, because that feels half-assed as well. Granted, in the original animation, that I've always felt that comes out of nowhere. True Love's Kiss, are you sure? Did you know her that well? Difference is, this movie takes a half an hour longer to get there, and I still feel like True Love's Kiss, are you sure? Did you know her that well?
Not to mention, there's this particularly strange scene where the thieves and the dwarves start to have the celebratory dance, and it's basically this quick little nostalgic hint of, yoo-hoo, remember this scene from the original? Yodelay, yodelay. I mean, I like a good dance scene, don't get me wrong, but something bothers me about this particular dance scene. It's the fact that it only lasts for less than 30 seconds, whereas the original dance scene lasted for a good few minutes or so. And that bothers me because this dance just seems so strangely spontaneous, and it's meant to be a celebration, but they just do it, but then it stops. And I'm sorry, that does not seem like an authentic dance party. And I know I have been to many Kaylee dance parties throughout my life, and I can guarantee you not a single dance party that I've been to, Kaylee or otherwise, not one of these dance parties had a dance routine of a large group of people that lasted less than 30 seconds. That is just... No, that doesn't happen. When a large group of people get together to dance, it usually lasts more than 30 seconds as a form of enjoyment. Like, do these people just never go outside? Outside of, like, their green screen studios?
Yeah. Weird.
And I was holding back my laughter when it was further revealed that Snow White was falling in love with the thief character, because there was so much emphasis with Rachel Zegler's interviews that Snow White doesn't need a man. Although, to be fair, they said she wasn't going to be saved by a prince. They didn't say anything about the thief character, so that's fair enough. But at the same time, given the woke agenda that people like Rachel Zegler and others are supporting, it was implied that Snow White don't need no man. And yes, she's falling. I can't. I can't do this anymore. Oh man, I can't. So, anyway, Evil Queen finds out that Hunt's been betrayed, and there's another certain portrayal of the narrative that bothers me. When the Evil Queen finds out that she's been duped by the Huntsman, she looks in the box and finds an apple in the place where Snow White's heart is meant to be. Now that bothers me, because in the original film, as true to the Grimm's version, the Huntsman did put a heart in the box, as the Queen requested, just not Snow White's heart. The magic mirror reveals that it's a heart of a pig, which is deceptively clever because pigs share the same organs as human beings. The reason why the portrayal of the box and what's in it bothers me in the live-action remake is the fact that the Evil Queen didn't bother to check the contents of the box beforehand. Like, if she found out that there was an apple there, she would have just executed the Huntsman on the spot. And yet she waits a while until then realize later that she's been deceived. Like, you see, with the original, you get the sense that she's checked what's in the box and there's a heart there, so it makes sense for her to be deceived. But with the new version, the Evil Queen doesn't even bother to look in the box. And that bothers me immensely. She comes across more as an idiot than a ruler. And a wee bit iffy on the hammy performance of the Evil Queen. I suppose it depends on your taste in Disney film, I guess. As well as your taste in Gal Gadot's acting prowess. But anyway, she disguises herself as a hag, and yeah, the hag makeup, it looks pretty good. But the whole hag transformation, it lacks the cinematic weightiness of the original. And although, to be fair, the way the hag tempts this particular Snow White into taking the apple, I thought, okay, that actually is logically viable given what we know about this particular character and her admirations for kindness and community. That does make sense. And so, of course, Snow White takes the apple, she dies, the dwarves mourn her death. The thief, with assistance from the huntsman, manages to escape. Part of me thinks, wait, if the two of them could yank at the chain before, why didn't they try that in the first place? And I guess it was because they ran out of hope, and the lack of hope leads to a lack of motivation, I guess. But still, it just seems a slight bit odd to me that they didn't think to combine their efforts beforehand, but yeah, whatever. So they escape the dungeons, and the thief comes to Snow White as she is dead. And so, of course, there is this nice moment of silence as the thief kisses Snow White back to life. Like, I actually appreciated that, but okay, what happens next? was another moment of me trying to hold back my laughter in the cinema, basically. The moment that Snow White gets up, you know, like, she gets up, the doors are saying, oh, she's alive, and the animals are very happy, but because it's so dull, the animals and the dwarves are not as enthusiastic as they were in the original, which is such a shame and disappointment. Snow White actively embraces her true love. Yeah, makes sense. But then immediately afterwards, she goes back to concern about her dads, and everyone is quiet about it. It's the fact that I'm sorry, everyone, all the other characters, are you not overjoyed to see your friend come back to life? And Snow White, like, you're not processing the fact that you passed on and now you're back to life. No, there's no time to process that. She's back to be having concerns about her king dad. This pacing is so off the walls. It's so incoherent. It's so spontaneous. The pacing for the core plot is far too quick for people to get a full grasp of proper characterization. They're just go, get the plot moving forward. But the plot never takes the time to properly develop the characters in a satisfying manner. And then Snow White, she said, I must step up to be the leader. I can't. I can't. So, Snow White comes up with a plan, and the way this plan is executed is particularly odd. Snow White's aim is to simply get a red cloak on and just announce that she's the princess who's finally returned. The evil queen, back to her usual self, greets her by the entrance with guards around her. She makes this argument that roses are temporary, diamonds are forever. Didn't think I'd make a James Bond joke, but there we go. Improvisation. She's basically, the evil queen compares herself to a diamond, compares Snow White to a rose to convince the public to not join Snow White's side. She wants people to think practically. And then evil queen does this whole thing of tempting Snow White to kill her, which I thought was actually somewhat interesting. Then Snow White persuades the guards, who were formerly bakers and cobblers and so on and so forth, used to work for the town. She appeals to that, and one by one, the guards emotionally resonate to Snow White's side, so the evil queen is powerless and alone, which is kind of interesting because that further proves my belief that politicians are only as powerful as people allow them to be, so keep note of that. But the execution of this plan is somewhat odd to me because there's this whole sequence where the dwarves, well, a brief sequence albeit, where the dwarves go through the dungeon passageway, but then when the queen is going to be defeated, the dwarves come up to stand in rebellion, even though the dwarves don't do anything. The dwarves might as well have walked in with Snow White. It's moments like that where you just have to think, good grief, they're ripping off Snow White and the Huntsman, and they're not even trying to make it work. Oh my days. So anyway, the short guy gets the perfect shot to save Snow White's life. Evil Queen retreats and is in denial of the magic mirror, leading her to smash it, leading her to get sucked into the magic mirror dimension, which is presumably the same place you can go to in Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep. And she is defeated, and Snow White becomes the queen, and blah, blah, blah. It's so dull and boring. Oh, and also Dopey talks. And I'm rather mixed on Dopey speaking. I get it's meant to be a heartfelt moment of Snow White encouraging this otherwise not very confident character to find confidence in himself. It's meant to be touching, but given the rest of the quality of the movie, it just comes across as more goofy than genuinely heartfelt. I know I sound like a complete jerk for saying that, but that's the way it kind of comes across. It comes across as somewhat pretentious, and I think in the hands of a better script, that whole sequence of Dopey learning to raise his voice could have been done so much better. I mean, now that I mention it, I'd be curious to see Dopey speaking up in a way that coherently works. But as a whole, this movie is just dull and boring, and I think that's the worst offense of this particular movie. Honestly, I think the controversy that I mentioned surrounding this movie is going to make more of an impact than the actual movie itself, and that's saying something. So, overall, this movie is dull, it's boring, it's lackluster, it lacks the narrative cohesion compared to the original version of the story that they are adapting. There's these undertones of wokeness which no doubt would have been played down due to the reshoots, which in turn has led to a lack of proper structure due to the mishmash of all these different cuts joining into one. It all seems so superficial. We all knew this was going to fail, and I was just curious to see how bad this gets. And it's boring, it's dumb, and I'm done with this movie. If there were any other positives, I would say Rachel Zegler does know how to sing well, and yeah. At the same time, it's rather telling that they deliberately dropped out Someday My Prince Will Come, which is a legacy Disney piece. And this movie seems like a pathetic attempt at mimicking a legacy movie that kickstarted the whole company in the first place. I give Snow White 2025 a 2 out of 12. Are you really surprised? We all knew this was going to fail. We all knew this was going to fail spectacularly. But were there any other ways in which this movie failed, which I didn't quite explain thoroughly? Let me know in the comments down below. I look forward to further conversation, and stay tuned for more content on this channel. In the meantime, ScotsThinker signing out, and forgetting this movie ever happened, hopefully. Oh yeah, give it to me, baby.
Yeah. Weird. Weird.
String of the birds are singing. Isn't it beautiful?